Hi, everyone. Welcome to our bi-monthly webinar. So a couple housekeeping that I want to go over before we get started. One thing is I'm finding that using Google Chrome is the best thing to do. So if you have any issues and you have to jump out, come back in using Google Chrome because it just seems to make the best thing that we're doing. So again, welcome to Women Who Dare. We are a membership council and we are empowering women to lead change, disrupt status quo, embrace gender equality to make the world a better place and be unstoppable together. So we hold our webinar twice per month. And this is a webinar where our members are hosting the event and they're sharing their expertise in the area of critical importance for you, our listeners. And everyone is muted. And if you have any questions at all, just drop them in the chat box. And then near the end of the program, Laura's going to be taking some of your questions there. And if we don't get to everybody's question, I promise Laura will follow up with you. So I'll be monitoring them for her. And also, I just want to suggest to everyone that you're in a quiet place, shut your phones off, just be really attentive to the program here because there's a lot of information that we're going to share with you. So with that, I'm going to jump right in by introducing our host today, who is one of our founding members of Women Who Dare, Dr. Laura Sicola. She's a professional speaker, a leadership communications coach, and founder of the Vocal Impact Productions, and she's located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Yay, Eagles.
Finally, victory.
Yeah. Her mission is helping people to confidently and authentically master the 3 C's of vocal executive presence, to command the room, to connect with your audience, and most importantly, Laura, to close the deal in any context. So I'm going to give it to you to take it away, and the webinar is yours.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Connie. All right, let's see. I'm going to share the screen here. Let's make sure everybody can see this. Connie, can you see this?
I can see it perfectly, yes.
Okay, terrific. So today we are going to talk about how to give a killer TED Talk. Now, Connie just gave a very little bit about my background. I am an executive communications coach. I do leadership communication training, which includes in part public speaking and presentation skills, but there's more to it than that. And I think most people who are joining us today are here for probably one of 3 reasons. Either you already have a TED Talk scheduled, in which case, congratulations. You aspire to give a TED Talk at some point in the near or distant future. Or C, you just want to learn how to be a better public speaker. And nowadays, culturally speaking at least, the TED Talk has kind of become the gold standard for public speaking. So we want to make sure that all the skills and strategies and tips that we talk about today are applicable for really almost any other speaking engagement you can think about. So let's see, advance here. All right, why me? Real quickly, aside from what Connie just listed, first, I've given 3 TEDx talks myself over the past decade or so. And truthfully, they were 3 completely and totally different experiences for a variety of reasons. The first one was about 10 years ago, before TED was quite the household name that it is now. I confess, I had no idea what a TED Talk was, and I didn't really do a lot of research on it. So I was unprepared for the context and the environment. And the organization that ran it was a local college, great intentions, undergrad project, and it was their first time running it. So the organizers really weren't aware of how to prepare the speakers. So double check with you when you do have a chance to give a talk, make sure that they have some materials to give you. The second and third TED Talks that I did, the organizers were much more organized, and they had all sorts of guidelines on what to expect and how to organize your approach, etc. So much more about the logistics and everything else to expect. So for example, in the beginning, I didn't realize that it has to be completely memorized. There is no podium. Slides or this, that, and the other thing. It was such a different context from the kinds of presentations I was used to giving. I think it still went well, but even the audio quality that they had and the video quality in the end was not very good. So it's not a talk that I typically put out there as much. The second one was much better. And I've been able to put that up, and there's almost 5 million hits now on that video after about 3.5 years. So I'm very proud of that one. And most recently, just a couple of months ago, I gave a TEDx talk at a military base. And what I learned from that one was that there are different kinds of TEDx talks, and this one happened to be what was called an internal talk. And if you are invited to give an internal talk, and I remember seeing it in the fine print on the contract, but I didn't really process what it meant. I just assumed it meant only military people were allowed to attend as guests. No big deal. But what it actually meant was the video would never be published. They could keep it internally, but I could never put it on YouTube. I could never put it on my website. I could never advertise the talk itself, other than mentioning like this that I've done it. So it's double check those kinds of details, especially if you're trying to use it for the sake of marketing, etc. I'm also a coach for the TED Fellows program, which is an arm of TED itself. I've coached tons of people through that program, and as well as individuals who are coming to me to work on TED programming. For example, I'm currently in the process of working with an organization who is preparing to create TEDx Luzira. And of all unusual contexts, Luzira is a maximum security prison in Uganda. So not the context in which most of you will most likely be speaking, but I've been working with them doing trainings on everything from writing the script to delivering a good talk, and I'll be working with them further through that. So with all that in mind, what creates a good TED Talk? You need to give, first and foremost, a compelling story. TED is all about storytelling. Data is important, experience is important, but the story is what makes or breaks an awesome TED Talk. And a good, compelling story should be surprising somehow. It should either give you information that on a topic you never would have considered, or otherwise share a perspective that is counterintuitive. For example, my second TED Talk, the title is "Want to Sound Like a Leader? Start by saying your name right." So even on something simple like that, it automatically catches the attention by saying, what do you mean start by saying your name right? How do you say it wrong? Where does that? So there's already a curiosity that begins. Your story also has to be relatable, no matter what it is. Now, I just did a webinar, like I mentioned, for some of the speakers who are getting ready for TEDx Luzira, and one of the chat questions that came through was from someone who was literally a death row inmate as a convicted murderer. And he said, how do you make being on death row as a convicted murderer relatable? I thought that was an incredibly valid question, because it's not something most people, God willing, have ever experienced or even been connected to. And what matters most of all is not that they can relate to the nature of the story itself, but they can imagine themselves in your shoes based on how you describe it, based on the details, based on what you share as far as your emotions, and based on how you tell the story. They have to somehow connect with you. And no matter what the story is, you have to find a way to build that connection. It also needs to be emotional, which is part of that relatability. And this is both sharing your own emotions as well as evoking the emotion in the listener. You cannot just go through the motions of sharing the details and the facts. You need to make sure that you're channeling something and that you're conveying the emotion that you claim to feel in that talk. You really also want to be inspiring, because a TED Talk, whether it's an actual global TED or a TEDx, it needs to make people sit up, take notice, and have a mindset shift. What are you going to inspire them to think or do differently after they leave? And in the end, what makes all of this happen is that your talk has to be credible. So what makes a talk credible? More importantly, what makes a speaker credible? Here's a quick little foundation. Whenever you have a message that you want to give, you're telling a story, giving a talk, or otherwise, you're communicating that story through 3 channels all at the same time. The first is the verbal channel, and this is your script, the words that you have chosen to deliver. The second is the vocal channel, and this is how your words sound as they come out. And the third is the visual channel. This is your body language and what message you're physically communicating. Imagine you were watching the video on mute. What would you see? What impression would you make? And all of these things need to be in alignment. They all need to work together, because when they're all communicating the same message at the same time, then that's what creates the impression of credibility as a speaker. But it's really important then to make sure that you're not missing something along the way. Shakespeare is one of the best playwrights in modern history, or semi-modern history at least, but you give me a copy of a Shakespeare script and expect me to do something with it on stage, it'll just be ugly, because I know my delivery is not going to match effectively. I'm not an actor, and those aren't my words. But the point of a good TED Talk is that they are your words, because it is your story. So you need to make sure that you do authentically match your delivery to what it is that you're saying. Verbal is the content, vocal and visual are the delivery. So today, what I really want to do is start by breaking down those three, the alignment of those three channels, the verbal, the vocal, and the visual, briefly, as how they relate to a TED Talk. Then I want to give a few tips on rehearsing, preparing for the delivery itself. And in the end, we'll touch on managing nerves, because I know that no matter how prepared you are, how excited you are about this opportunity, as the day gets closer, and especially as you're waiting for them to call your name so you can walk out on stage, the heart rate starts to kick in. And we'll want to get that under control, channel that energy in a positive way, and really be able to step up and nail the delivery. So let's start with verbal. Point number one, start with the end in mind. It's critical to be able to answer the question of what's the one thing when they leave, the audience, when they leave after hearing my talk, what's the one thing that I want them to remember? What's the one message that needs to stick if they forget everything else I've said? So how do you want them to think differently? What do you want them to feel? And how do you want them to behave in a different way when you leave? No matter what your story is, this should be your guiding compass. Overall, I have found that there are two types of talks. The first is a personal story. And as you're telling your story, like some of the people who I'm working with in this particular TEDx upcoming event, where many of them either are or were in prison, there's a life story to be told in there. And there are lessons that they learned and realizations that they learned along the way. On the flip side, my TED Talks have always been about a lesson. It's a principle or a concept that I'm teaching. And then there are personal stories along the way. Sometimes they're my stories, sometimes they're other people's stories, but the stories are illustrating those key points. They're sort of two sides of the same coin, just which angle you're looking at it from. And you need to pick which one it's going to be, because that keeps the flow going smoothly, keeps it cohesive. Ultimately, both of those types of talks answer the question, so what? The audience has to be able to say, why am I here? What did I get out of this? What's that one thing? Why should I care? Okay, some basic guidelines to crafting the story, to writing the script. Number one, honesty and vulnerability. Yes, sure, they'd love to hear how you made $1 million or how you won the Olympics or how you had some other great success, but that's not relatable. It might be exciting and it might be something that people could dream of doing, just imagine, but what makes it relatable is also knowing where you screwed up or where you had a weakness or where you were otherwise at a low point. Share those low points as well as the high points, because showing what you have overcome is what inspires people to think, wow, if she could overcome that, I can do it too. Logical order sort of goes without saying, but especially in talk type number 2, where it's a principle that you're trying to teach with those little lessons, those personal lessons added in between, it can be easy to get lost in tangents or down a bit of a winding road. Make sure you always have a reason for putting topic A first, topic B second, and topic C third, and link them in a way that's clear to everybody else. And again, it may go without saying for some, but your introduction and your conclusion have to be rock solid. Catch their attention in the first sentence and finish with some sort of a call to action that wraps everything up and says, take this and go forth and use it to do good in the world. Facts and opinions. It's really important if you have a talk that is very factually, statistically, scientifically, mathematically, historically based, that you are not just giving the facts. People need the stories to bring those stats to life. Similarly, you need to then cite your sources. If you're going to talk about a research study, or you're going to talk about whatever else it happens to be, if there is a source involved, mention either explicitly where it came from, or more likely on a slide. If you have a visual, just put a little footnote. But it is important to let people know that you're not just making numbers up as you go along. And if you are giving opinions in the sense of pontificating on some particular issue, asserting a recommendation of some sort, you need to make sure that you have justified those with facts to back it up. So again, facts and opinions go hand in hand. Descriptive language is critical. So on the one hand, you want, where possible, throw in a little bit of narration. Narrate your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions as you were going. If something surprised you, and go beyond just saying, I was surprised, or assuming that they would know that you were surprised. Tell them, my heart stopped, or my brain was scrambled as I was trying to figure out what was happening. I couldn't understand why he was doing this, or why this could possibly happen to me. I thought I was. Express what you were thinking and narrate. The 5 senses, go back to your third grade classroom and retap into those 5 senses. What did you see in that moment that hit you so hard? Could you smell something that now triggers a memory every time? Was there something you could taste? Whether it was your grandmother's apple pie, or the taste of victory that was right there, or the taste of bile in your mouth as you were gritting your teeth. What could you touch? And touch and physical feeling is both imagine a person's touch, or the cloth that was made out of the blanket, or the blanket was made out of, but it's also, what did you feel in your stomach? Did you feel your stomach bottom out? Did you feel your heart leap out of your chest, for better or for worse? These are the feelings that we want to imagine. Or what did you hear? All of these pieces, when you start to add these sensory details, bring the story to life and help the listener to imagine themselves in the story, to get lost in the story. Transitions are a critical tool in writing a good story that has flow, because a good story should not make people stop and process and try to figure out what you meant at different points before you move on. There should be a nice, even, smooth current from point A to point B, and transitions are going to help you link them together, keep that continuity of flow. So if you want to think about a talk as being a house that you're trying to build, your stories and your data points, these are the bricks. But you can't just pile up a bunch of bricks and call it a house. You need to have cement to link them together. And the transitional phrases and transitional sentences are going to help connect them logically. You're spoon feeding that logic to the listener, and it just helps them to get it that much more easily. Transitions are also a really great tool to use as when you're trying to do the memorization stage later on, because very frequently when I'm trying to memorize something, I'll get to a point, and for whatever reason, after point C or whatever it happens to be, I always forget what's next. So I know that I need to go in and add a good transition in there, because then when I get to the end of point C, if there's a sentence that has something like, so little did I know that teaching third grade for 3 years would prepare me for a life of coaching executives. And then I can go into the connection point of how that would, going from job A to job G, whatever it is. So those kinds of segues can be a rhetorical question, like, so why on earth would I think that doing this would help me that way? Or how could I have known that this other calamity was waiting around the corner? Those kinds of statements are good transitions. They sort of build a little bit of suspense, and they help the audience predict what kind of information is going to come next. It's not that your story is predictable, but when you give those little cues, it's like a GPS cue that says, get ready to turn left in 500 feet. Okay, as long as I know it's coming, the ride will be smoother. No less exciting or interesting, just smoother. details. There's two different expressions that we have. God is in the details and the devil is in the details. And as far as writing a talk is concerned, it's frankly both. And there's two common mistakes that people tend to make with regard to adding details in their stories. First is too much detail. They either go on lots of tangents or they're rambling and they get repetitive, giving too many examples. And all of this tends to eat up time. One of the biggest challenges in giving a TED Talk is that you have so much you want to share, but you have to smash it into 6 minutes, 10 minutes, maximum 18 minutes. That is a very short period of time to tell a life lesson. So you have to make sure that your examples and your details are as succinct as possible. One or two, then hit the point and move on. There's somebody that I was working with a couple of years ago, and he was, in the beginning when I saw his first draft, he was describing the first time he went on a mission journey with his church, and they were at a prison. Theme appears apparently. And it was about how he was so moved by what he saw. And in describing it, some of the people who he met, various inmates who were there, it was one tragic sob story after another. And the first one really hits you. Good, very impactful. The second one was, oh my gosh, that's true too. Okay, now I'm getting a picture. I understand how horrific this place is. By the third one, you're going, okay, I got it. And by the fourth and the fifth, you're thinking, I need to go, I don't know, watch a cartoon or do something mindless because you've got me so depressed right now. I know that somewhere redemption is going to come into this story, but I can't afford to wait for it anymore. This is just too painful. So you don't want to lose people through those. We ended up picking two examples that showed the diversity of the challenges faced, and that was enough to make the point. And then we could move on and get to the good stuff about where he took all of this information. On the flip side, some people will not give enough detail. Sometimes they are so busy focusing on what the facts are that they're not really turning it into a story. They're not making it relatable. Alternatively, for example, there's someone I'm currently working with, and in talking about the challenges that she has overcome at various stages in life, they're phenomenal stories of redemption and of turning lemons into lemonade, so to speak. But we realized that as she was talking, in certain sections, there were lots of detail that was extremely relatable. I really empathized with her. I felt connected to her. And then there were other sections where it just seemed like kind of a laundry list of information. And we realized that in those times where there was just the facts cut and dry, those were the parts of the story that she was still working through in her heart. They were the parts where she was still trying to just get through that part of the talk in trying to deal with it. And she wasn't ready, or she had not been ready up till that point, to really allow herself to share as much as she knew she'd need to go as vulnerable and as deep as she would, to make that part of the story as meaningful as the others. So we had to work on that. So detail, finding the balance is critical. Okay, writing the script itself is also a challenge. So here's a couple of tips. First, just know it takes 3 to 5 times as long as you think it does. So as soon as you have the opportunity, start now. And frankly, even if you don't have a TED Talk scheduled, start outlining what you think you'd want to talk about now, because any sort of jump you can get will only be helpful in the future, even if you really change directions quite a bit. For most events, if the organizers are organized, they will ask you to turn in a draft at least a month in advance, a complete draft. So if you're someone who likes to wait to the last minute, it's not going to work. You really need to start quickly, because again, your first draft is probably going to be half an hour, 45 minutes long, because you're putting so much into it. And to be able to whittle it all down into whatever few minutes worth of time frame they give you, that takes just as long as getting the original information out. You do have to memorize this, so the script has to be tight. There is no opportunity to ad lib, and we'll talk more about this later. But know that whatever you write has to be the words that you plan to say. So be really meticulous in how you articulate your ideas. And what seems like it should be the simplest part, but in many ways can be the hardest, is the need to keep your language conversational. A TED Talk is a conversation. Yes, it's a monologue, but other than that, you're really just having a chat with a few close friends and perhaps a few million viewers later on. So how do you do that? Part of it is to remember that this is not an essay. It's not a report. It's not a prospectus. It's not a proposal. All the things that we've been trained to write, either through our academic background or in our current profession, job roles, we're taught to write in a professional way. But that is not the way we talk. So we need to start to undo some of that. A system that I like to use is I'll start by thinking aloud. I'll open up my smartphone and just open the voice memo app on it. And then literally I will go out into my backyard and just pace around the yard or pace through the house, up and down the hallway, and just talk to myself. Brainstorm, data dump, whatever ideas I have. If I can think of a story I'd like to tell or an example I'd like to use, I will tell the whole story to myself and explain why. That way, then when I'm done recording it, I'll sit down and transcribe it. Not every word verbatim, because there's plenty of parts where I'm going to go, oh my gosh, where was I going with that? Okay, note to self. Yes, the idea was good, but way too blabby and rambly. So fix that later. But other times, you're going to hear yourself get on a really good roll explaining something. You're going to think, wow, that was great. I said that. It was great emotion, and it was really natural and authentic, and I felt passionate, and it was clear and concise. I want to do it just like that again. Great. For that part, transcribe it verbatim so that you can use it again. And then when you try to memorize it, it is completely natural and authentic sounding because they were your spoken words in the first place. And of course, you can always go back and revise. But remember that revise does include cleaning it up a little bit. Of course, if you used a lot of ums and you knows, you don't want to add those in. But there's a difference between revision and sanitization. You don't want to sanitize your speech because that's when you start pulling it back into formal writing. And that's when it loses authenticity and starts to sound mechanical. Allow your speech to be human. Avoid jargon, or if you do have to use a technical word here and there, define it and make it clear why you're using that word, and then use it more than once so people understand what it is. But again, only in the context necessary. And here's something that a lot of people find challenging. Use contractions when you write, whenever possible, when writing a script. Because while we know that the sentence we're thinking may be, had I known, or if I'd known you were coming, I would have picked you up at the airport. If you write down, if I had known you were coming, I would have picked you up at the airport, and you memorize it like that, it sounds kind of clunky, kind of robotic and mechanical. The fact is, we would naturally say, if I'd known, not if I had known, if I'd known you were coming, I would have picked you up, not I would have picked you up. But if you write would have, you will naturally memorize would have. And then you wonder why it never connects. So allow yourself to use as many contractions as possible in your script so that as you memorize, it comes out naturally. All right, so enough on the content. Let's go into the delivery. First, the vocal component. Your energy and your mood starts in your voice. So the same way that when you go to a restaurant and the food comes out and it looks beautifully laid out on the plate and it smells great, that primes you for what you're going to eat and you're already ready to love the flavor. You have to connect with your content and have the energy desired, positive or negative, is have that come through first, because people will feed off that energy and it will prime them for how you want them to start to think about what you're talking about, how you want them to receive it. Should they be excited? Should they find it funny? Should they be angry by it? Your mood will convey that first and ingrain it in them as they listen to what you're saying. So connecting with your content is really important. You cannot just relate it. There was somebody that I worked with not too long ago on a TED Talk, and in many ways, this is where the emotional piece was difficult, because she was so concerned about trying not to forget what she was saying that she wasn't really thinking about the meaning of what she was saying. And part of her talk was recognizing that was describing a 911 call on an abuse hotline. And it was a conversation between the hotline worker and the person in distress. But as she was going through the dialogue, I couldn't hear the difference. I had to really focus on what the words were to try to figure out who was saying what, because she was just focusing on just trying to remember what to say. We need to really recognize, is this person in distress, or is this person trying to be calm and reassuring and keep that person on the line until they can get help? Make sure that you connect with your content. And to that point, you're not just retelling your story, you have to relive it. You have to channel what you were feeling or thinking during the time that that particular event occurred. And I'm not saying be melodramatic, right? You're not going over the top. This is not acting. I'm not an actor. I couldn't teach you to act if I wanted to. I'm a linguist. You're going to be yourself. But if this is your story, remember how you felt when that happened and allow part of that feeling to drive your energy and drive your mood as you're speaking. So a couple of little tactics. Number one, volume and articulation. Don't mumble. As you get lost in your head, it's very easy to trail off a little bit, or otherwise you start talking really quickly and that makes your words blur together a bit. Articulate clearly. Note also that the microphone is a tool, it's not a crutch, especially for people who are not used to speaking in public. Often once the microphone is pinned on and they hear themselves booming out of the speakers on either side of the stage, it's like, oh, wow, okay, I'm really loud. I'm not used to that, so I'm going to tone it down and not be surrounded by my own voice so much. But at that point, you're forcing the microphone and the speakers to do the work for you. And that makes you sound timid. That makes you sound uncertain. That undermines your credibility. So we want to make sure that you talk as if you did not have a microphone. I don't mean scream. I just mean make the people in the back row know that you want them to understand this too. You're aiming as much of this information at them as you are toward the people in the front. And then let the sound guys in the back adjust the mixing board to figure out what volume needs to come out of the speakers to match your delivery. You also want to vary your volume to match parts of the story. So for example, if I were going to tell a story about my parents when I was growing up, I could say that if we didn't get into arguments too often, there were not too many times that I really got myself in trouble, but when I did, they had very different ways of dealing with it. When my mom got mad, she would just get frustrated and explode, and it would be loud, and she'd talk to me quickly, and she'd go blah, blah, blah. And I thought, oh, okay, mom's mad. Dad, when he got mad, he got quiet. And his words were measured, short, his volume was low. And when that happened, I knew I was a dead woman. So either parent has their own way of communicating. And I wanted to try to demonstrate that as I was telling the story. So with the volume, as well as other factors, this is ways to bring the story to life and keep the variety flowing, which keeps people's attention and interest. Along with volume is speed and pausing. Be careful not to talk too fast. And this primarily happens for two reasons. One, you've got a 12-minute deadline and you're trying to fit in 15 minutes worth of content. Bad idea. Go back, edit, take out some information, take out some sentences, and make sure that it comfortably fits into the time frame. The other reason, of course, is because adrenaline kicks in and you start to have that snowball effect. So you need to really control your speed. And you again want to vary that speed to match the story. Just like I just described with my parents, I varied the volume, but also with mom, she was going really fast and really angry and very loud. But my father was slow, controlled, restrained, if anything, lots of pauses in there. And you can feel the difference between how the two people responded. To that point, strategic pauses are essential. Number one, at the end of a sentence, and especially at the end of a paragraph or the end of a point, there should be a pause. I should be able to hear a period the same way that I can see a period if I'm looking at the script. It helps me to process what you're saying to me. And pauses also in certain places are great for doing things like building suspense. We have that phrase, the pregnant pause. So if I'm going to tell you something that's incredibly important, I'll give a second and then tell you what it is, because I want you sort of on the edge of your seat, waiting to hear what it is. Make them lean in for it a little bit. But more importantly, it also simply gives people a chance for their brains to catch up to their ears. So you've just given them all this information, pause, let them digest, go, okay, and then you move on to the next point. Breath support and vocal fry. Know that air in general is the fuel for your voice. So when you speak, you want to make sure that you have a nice, full, resonant voice that does justice to your story. Vocal fry is that habit where people often talk and they crackle out their voices like this, kind of froggy or creaky sounding. And you wouldn't think that that's you, but it's amazing how often people slide into this pattern without realizing it. And when that happens, it sounds tired, bored, timid, insecure. None of that says credible. None of that says, trust me, listen to me, take my word for it, and do what I'm telling you to do. Often it happens because people are trailing off at the end of this sentence. They take a breath and they start fine, but then as they're going on, they keep going and they don't stop to take another breath and they sort of fall off this cliff and the voice gets tired and creaky sounding again. So that can often happen either because your sentence is too long and you haven't figured out a good place to take a pause, insert a comma, or you're nervous and you're just trying to think about getting through the whole thing, which means you're not rehearsed well enough yet. Make sure that you are comfortable and relaxed enough when you're talking that you're not trying to squeeze blood out of a stone. And that's another place where those strategic pauses are critical because they simply give you a place to breathe. Okay, intonation. This is the pitch variations, also known as tonality, but looking at how your voice goes up and down in different points. A wider range of tonality shows greater vocal interest. It holds the audience's attention better. I don't mean that you should go up and down, and up and down, and up and down. That just sounds ridiculous. But you do want to vary. At what points in the story, there's a lot more variety and you're going to go higher or lower, and the times that are going to be a bit more even. But there needs to be reason in each piece of your story to justify the type of intonation that you're using. Two bad habits that you want to avoid on sort of opposite ends of the spectrum: monotony and uptalk or upspeak. Monotony, as you're probably familiar, is really when there's just almost no variation in tonality or intonation and you just sort of keep talking, but everything sounds a little bit dry and flat as you're talking. Now, this is something that most of us would say, oh, I would never do that. But you'd be amazed how many people who are otherwise quite dynamic people in general conversation, when they get into that memorization mode, trying to recite a script that they've worked on 400 times, they do slide into it. Or they're so worried about being perfect and not making any mistakes that they lose that connection with their content and they get a bit monotonous. I mentioned that in the other talk, the woman describing the conversation on the 911 call, you couldn't hear the difference between the worker and the caller. Similarly, I worked with someone not too long ago who was describing times where there were great joy in her life, but also where there was great stress, except they sounded exactly the same. They just all sounded very even and measured, whether she was saying how her life seemed perfect from the outside or whether it's that she was drowning inside. It was all very measured. It was all very polished. It was all very poised, but there was no connection to what she was saying. So we want to make sure that there's variation in your intonation. Uptalk, on the other hand, is that pattern that sounds like you're asking questions, even when you're not. It's kind of really annoying after a while, but it sounds like you're asking a bunch of questions like, okay, right? You know, at that point, it makes you sound insecure, like you're not really confident in what you're saying. This is, again, something that will undermine your authenticity and undermine your credibility because that verbal, vocal, and visual are out of alignment. So in order to combat uptalk, you need to use vocal punctuation. If you wrote a period, I want to hear a period. And in a period, your voice drops, comes down. If there's an exclamation point, it might also drop, but starts from a higher point before it comes down. This is where the exclamation points come in. A comma might have a little bit of a rise, and a question mark could have a big rise, depending on what kind of question it is. But I want to hear the punctuation. If you wrote it for a reason, I need to hear that reason. Okay, so let's slide from the vocal into stage 3, which is the visual, your physical delivery. A quick, simple body language checklist just to run through for yourself before you start is the acronym PEGS. And it stands for, first, the P is posture. Yes, stand tall, have good posture, not stiff like a statue, but you want to make sure you're not slumping over, your head's not craning forward, you're not sort of cocked off to one side. Sit up straight or stand up straight, as mom always told you to do. Be careful about shifting your weight back and forth or swaying, that sort of boat rocking. As people are talking, they don't even know that they're doing it. Or sometimes they'll go back and forth, just rocking on their from heel to toe. And it's a nervous habit, but it's completely and totally distracting. I actually just watched somebody's TED Talk, and a quite well-viewed one. And her talk was very specifically on leadership communication, and or at least on executive presence, let's put it that way. But the entire time, her feet never moved from the one spot, but she shifted to her right foot and shifted to her left foot. And then she shifted to the right foot, and then she'd shift to the left foot. And I just thought, do something else. But it's that rhythmic shift every 30 seconds or so that to me was just distracting, especially considering what she was talking about. It didn't match her own instructions. Use the allocated floor space. As I referred to earlier, there is no podium, so you can't bring your notes with you, but there is a rug in the middle of the stage. No matter how big the stage or the room is, there will be a little, typically circle, but not necessarily red for TED. And it's probably 6 or 8 feet wide. We're not talking about a big space, but I do recommend using it. You don't have to stand only in that 1 2x2 footprint. Take a couple steps to one side, talk to people on that side of the audience, turn, face the other side, take a few more steps as you are starting a new part of the conversation, talk to people on that other side, and then shift your gaze. But use the space. Decide when you want to stand in the middle, when you're going to move one way or another. But you have that space, it's yours. The E from PEGS is eye contact, which is a general rule of thumb. Of course, make eye contact with your audience, which sometimes is harder than you think, especially when all the spotlights are blazing down on you. You sort of can't see much of anybody. But that being said, try looking at all the audience zones. And for me, if you think about it like a checkerboard, there's back right, back left, front left, and center. And as long as at various points in the conversation, in the talk, you're looking at each of those zones, most people will feel like you've looked in their general direction at some point. And especially if you're someone who gets nervous about looking at all of these different people, then this is a way to just sort of find a happy middle ground where you're making the audience feel a connection with you, but you're not getting lost in their eyes. Be careful also not to keep looking up as you're trying to remember what you're saying, or looking down or to the side as you're trying to recall the next line. You got to rehearse it, because that just totally gives you away that you don't really know what you're talking about. The G from PEGS is gestures, especially hands and head motions. Your motions need to reinforce the content, the meaning, and the feeling of what you are saying. So on the one hand, don't fidget. I had a client I worked with, and he didn't realize that his hands were constantly moving as he was talking in conversation, or even as he was presenting. So we did a quick little video, and just a minute or two, and I had him watch it. And all I said was, "So what'd you think?" And he was quiet for a second. And then he finally said, "I'm going to cut off my hands." He just had no idea that he was that fidgety as he was talking. But he realized how completely distracting it was and how nervous it made him look. So don't fidget. Keep your hands out of your pockets, keep them off your face. Don't fold and unfold your arms. Be careful not to wring your hands or pick at your fingernails. Those are some of the biggest ones. Also, don't pantomime. I've worked with a number of people where they think to themselves, well, I have to use body language, I have to use gestures as I'm talking, so every word ended up being choreographed, and they were trying to have some kind of motion to match the meaning of the word. This is not charades, and it's not American Sign Language, or any sign language for that point. So yes, there should be some motions, and they should be meaningful, but not every word or every sentence needs to have a motion to go along with it. Be selective and strategic. Also, don't use what I like to call dinosaur arms or T-Rex arms. Now, it's a little hard to see in the webinar frame, but do this with me at home. take your elbows and pin them to your sides, pin them to your rib cage. And then from there, since all that's left is your hands, just sort of, flap your wrists a little bit. These are T-Rex arms. And a lot of people feel like, okay, well, I should have hand motions. I should gesture somehow. So now I'm gesturing. But really all it looks like is silly little sort of floppy hands. And a lot of people will just go back and forth. It's like the physical equivalent of, so, it's like, these are not effective gestures. If that's what's going to happen, keep your hands just fingertips together down at your waist as a simple home base, so to speak. And the S from PEGS, very simply speaking, is smile when appropriate. That's the thing. Of course, for my death row inmates, no, there's not a lot that they're going to be smiling about. But at the same time, there's a woman that I worked with who is a human rights advocate in some Eastern European countries. And she was telling the story about, her topic was more about human rights violations with regard to the mentally ill. And as the only happy point in her entire talk was in the beginning when she was describing her experience as a little girl with a favorite relative and how that relationship was good. The rest of it was hard message to deal with. And she told it very well, but as contrast, she needed to smile in the beginning to show what an innocent, happy child she was and what the relationship was like. So you need to have that balance. Your facial expressions also need to match the words and the nature of the story. It helps the audience to connect with you. And this is much like your voice will help to prime them, your facial expressions and your body language will also do the same thing. It's part of smelling the food and seeing the food before you actually taste it. All right, a couple of last topics. So we're done with the verbal, vocal, visual. Slides, which are sort of part of your visual, just not your physical communication. Let's see. The first, slides, if you use them, the purpose should be to instantly convey or reinforce a core point. When somebody looks at a slide, they should look at it, go, okay, got it, and then look back to you for additional information. You do not want them studying the slide, trying to understand it, trying to process everything that's there. If they do that, then you end up getting them distracted because they cannot look at one thing and listen to another. Even if they're related, if they're not identical, they cannot process both at the same time. So give them a minimal amount to quickly see and then rely on you to hear the rest of the details. A slide can also help to prompt you on to the next topic. You finish talking about a particular story, you're trying to remember what's next. If you hit the clicker and you see what the topic, what the picture, what the statistic is that's up there, you go, oh, right, okay, talk about this. So it can help you if you know that you need a little bit of help in those areas to have just a couple of slides that are useful transitions. Some guidelines for making a good TEDx slide or TED Talk slide. Point of contrast, this webinar is not a good example of TED slides. This is simple informational delivery in webinar format. I'm breaking all the TED rules. So I put this out to you explicitly. Slides, first of all, for a TED Talk are not necessary. If you want them, great, but don't force it. Also, you want to have one idea per slide. That's it. It could be a single word or a number or a picture or a phrase, but it's not going to be whole sentences unless it's maybe a famous quote or something like that. But the most minimal amount of words per page possible. Do not use bullets. Do use pictures. A picture is worth 1,000 words. So if you're trying to explain what something looked like or the situation that you were in, and you can put up a picture of it, put the picture up. 2 seconds. They got the gist. Now you can skip all those details and talk about other things. You use your time a lot more efficiently. And where possible, especially for statistics or pictures that you post, make sure you cite your sources and get copyright. TED is a stickler on copyright. If you get images that you do not have copyright for, they will not post your video, period. And rehearsal. So now with regard to this great talk that you just prepared, How do you get ready to give it? I mentioned you have to memorize the script. This is non-negotiable. Personally, this is the part of giving a TED Talk that I like the least, to put it mildly. I love doing talks like this, where I know my content, but I get to ad lib a little bit, tell stories, change this, change that, answer questions, whether it's here on a webinar or in front of an audience, in a classroom. I need to know my information down pat, but I don't want to have to memorize it verbatim. It feels a little bit constraining to me. Doesn't matter, for a TED Talk, I have to memorize it, and that's all there is to it. So a couple of tips. Do not try to ad-lib. Ad-libbing is your enemy because, as I mentioned before, because of the time frame, the time limits, as you're rehearsing, you're working on revising and editing your stories so that they are as concise and efficient as possible. When you ad-lib, you lose that conciseness. It may have taken you 30 seconds to read the story aloud when you're on script, but when you ad-lib for whatever reason, now suddenly it takes a minute or two. So that is something that we have to really be careful of. So do give yourself time for that. Start as soon as possible. Again, it takes much, much longer to do the refining in the rehearsal stage than you would expect. Record yourself and listen often. So one way that I like to do it is when I have the script in front of me, again, I'll take out my audio recorder and I will just read the whole thing aloud as dramatically as I would want to deliver it, and make sure that that's available on my phone or elsewhere, so that if I'm washing dishes, if I'm in the car, or anywhere else where I am doing something that I don't have to pay a lot of attention to, I want to reinforce it in my mind. I want to plant it in there. So if I can hear myself saying it, it helps it to sink in more. And I can try to practice reciting along with myself in the recording as well. Memorize in chunks. Don't try to do the whole thing all at once. And something that works for many people is to memorize it backwards. What I mean by that is start with the last paragraph. Get that down. Then do the paragraph before it. Because if you work in that sequence, then as you're working through the clunky part that you're less confident with, when you get to the end of that, you gain momentum and confidence as you go, because you're working towards the stuff that you know better and better. And that helps some people with their confidence in particular. And this is also where you want to include clear transitions, like I mentioned originally. If you find that as you're trying to do your memorization, that there's a couple of places where you always get stuck and you just can't remember what came next, that's a sign that you need a better transition, that it's either not a logical segue between these two topics, or you just need a more explicit statement to wrap up the first piece to remind yourself what's next. A couple of quick physical practice tips, and then we'll wrap up. Number one, practice out loud. Don't just sit there and try to silently rehearse in your mind. You have to hear it come out of your mouth and see where you get stuck. Practice your movements and gestures. So from the very beginning, even when you're just doing the script read aloud, put your hands into it, stand up, put your facial expressions into it. That has to be natural too. That cannot be an afterthought. Practice in your performance shoes. And frankly, do whole dress rehearsals. Do not go out the day before and buy a new outfit with a new pair of shoes, because the last thing you want to be doing is standing up there thinking, God, my feet hurt. Whatever outfit you're going to be in, get used to performing in that outfit. And here's another tip. Ladies, don't wear a dress. Or if you do wear a dress, make sure it's got a belt of some sort, because they need a place to clip on the microphone battery pack. And if you only have a dress, then the only place for them to clip it on is the back of your collar. And it's a big, heavy box, so it can pull down on that collar, which makes this part ride up and is uncomfortable. Plus there's an antenna back there, and it's going to keep messing around in your hair. You don't want something poking you in the back of the head while you're trying to give your TED talk. So do not sabotage yourself with a single one-piece dress. Even the makeup. I worked with someone who was getting ready to give her TED talk, and she didn't realize that she almost never wore makeup, lip balm and chapstick, mascara. That was about it. But for the TED talk, they actually had a professional to do hair and makeup. And she realized at the last second that they had put lip gloss on her, which looked pretty, but she was constantly aware of how sticky her lips felt. And that's a distraction that you don't need when you're getting ready to go on stage. So whatever you're going to perform in, make sure you practice in it too. And practice with the remote control. If you have slides that you need to advance, You don't want to be used to just clicking the button on your computer and then suddenly realize that now you're on stage and you've got this thing in your hand that you're not used to holding, and it messes up your gestures and it feels awkward and it's distracting. Practice with the remote if you're going to use it. Finally, managing your nerves. Your adrenaline can be your best friend or your worst enemy if it's not under control. First, remind yourself and be very clear on this. Your body does not know the difference between whether you're nervous or excited. You just have the adrenaline rush kick in. That fight or flight syndrome kind of takes over. But it's just adrenaline. So when you start to feel that heart rate kick in, don't allow yourself to go down the mental rabbit hole saying, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous, I'm so nervous, I'm so nervous, because that just exacerbates a bad situation. Instead, turn it around and remind yourself, I'm so excited, this is great, I want to be here, this is important to me, it's a great opportunity. Ride the energy wave, channel it into something positive. Just like you can psych yourself out, you can psych yourself in. Also practice square breathing. If you feel yourself starting to get worked up, you can do it in your seat or go to the restroom and stand there in a stall by yourself for a few minutes. But very briefly, square breathing is where you inhale and you count. Inhale through your nose. Then you hold it for the same count. And then you exhale for the same count or longer through your mouth, through pursed lips. Then you hold the emptiness for the original count. That's one cycle. And if you do that 5 or 10 times, if you were to take your pulse before you start and take it again afterwards, you will see a huge difference. Trust me on this, and give it a try. Also, talk slower than feels natural, because that adrenaline is going to have a gravitational pull to make you talk faster and faster. So if you're trying to talk more slowly than you think is necessary, they'll balance out and you'll end up delivering at a pace that's very natural for the listener. Finally, mindset shift. And this is our last point. The fact is, it's not about you. It's about the audience. Get out of your way, get out of your head. They're not trying to ding you on making any mistakes. The idea is you want to give them the best experience possible. And if you allow that to be your guiding light, you're guaranteed to give a really powerful, meaningful delivery. So get enough sleep, stay away from caffeine and alcohol for obvious reasons, also because they're diuretics, so they'll dry you out. Drink a lot of water and remember to breathe. So when in doubt, remember to focus on your why. Why are you there? What's your bigger mission? And what's the message that you want to give? Let that be your driving force. And then have fun, because that's what it should all be about. So with that, any questions? I know we just have a minute or two left.
Yeah, Laura, that was fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. I actually got a couple questions. The one
Okay,
question,
I'm having a hard time seeing them from here, so I'll leave it to you to share them with me.
oh, okay, yes. The one question we have is from Simone Williams, and she talks about cupcakes.
Yep.
And you had talked about what to bring on stage and what's appropriate. She wants to know if it is appropriate for her to bring real cupcakes on stage with her.
My instinct is no. I think it would depend on why. Are you going to do something with the cupcakes, or is it just to demonstrate? If it's just to show people examples, put it in a picture and put it in a slide, because at that point, the slide image will be much, much bigger than the original cupcakes. And so people will really get to see your beautiful designs, your cute decorations that you make with them, etc. And it'll be just as mouth-watering. So yeah. I would recommend doing it in a slide instead.
Okay, great. Well, she could probably have maybe afterwards say, hey, come and see me. I have samples or something. Maybe
nope, like nope, not at a TED Talk. This is not a place of sell. Do not pitch. Keep your logos off your slides. Keep your company names out of it. You are not there to pitch. That's a big social no-no.
Okay, good advice, good advice. So how does someone go about getting selected to give a TED Talk?
So that's a whole other issue. The short answer is there are two basic approaches. One, for me, for the 3 that I did, I got invited. So it made my life a lot easier. People who knew me, knew what I did either because they found me online from something else or because they knew me through working different contexts. They said, we're having a TED event. Here's the theme. Would you be willing to come and talk? That makes it easy. But typically, if you go online and you Google TEDx call for speakers, there are applications that you can fill out, and you need to send in a proposal, perhaps an outline. Different organizations will have different formats, but you propose, and then they let you know if you've been accepted or not. You do not get a lot of time. At best, you'll get maybe 2 or 3 months for most. So once you're accepted, you're going to have to hit the ground running.
Okay. Okay. Really, really good advice, because I've seen some where you pay.
I have not seen that. I'm,
Oh,
I'm sure they exist, but I've never had to. That was
okay.
never an issue.
So, because I was just curious if they're reputable or not.
I've never heard of that.
So I guess that's something that would be a different conversation that
Yes,
we would have.
definitely.
So again, Laura, fantastic. Everybody listening, just a big cheers for Dr. Laura Sicola. And she also has a free gift. If you
Yep.
go over to vocalimpactproductions.com/free gift, you can check her out there. And of course, if you want some more information on how to give a TED Talk, by all means, reach out to Laura and she can definitely help you with that. So this is
Absolutely.
all we have for today. I'm Connie Fife. I'm the chair of the Fife Group and founder of Women Who Dare Council. And we have many listeners on the call with us today, many of those that are not members yet of our Women Who Dare Council, but you could join us. Just head over to womenwhodare.com to get more information. And that's our big pitch for today, but thank you all for being here. Come back again on February 28th, where our very own Sophia Ellis is going to be talking about how to create a strategy to get social media to work for you. So make sure you
Great.
come back. We got a lot more happening, a lot more programs coming up with womenwhodare.com. Thanks for being here. And just one final comment from Kathleen Caldwell. She just wants to say praise and appreciation for Laura Sicola for your
Thank you, Kathleen.
tremendous expertise. So thank you, Kathleen Caldwell, for that.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Everybody, have a great Valentine's Day, and we'll be talking to you again real soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Connie.
Thank you.
Bye.